I kind of wanted to start, I think where probably a lot of people are starting is, yeah, most of my life I've dealt with depression. I haven't dealt with the anxiety side as much. This last year has completely changed that for me. I'm struggling with all kinds of anxiety issues. I'm having panic attacks, which are brand new to me. So I want to just sort of start with, what has this last year done to us, on a deeper level, not just, man, this is tough, but what is the anxiety doing to us physically?
Well, I would say, anxiety has a number of physical downstream effects. Blood pressure is one of the big ones. This is why when we go to the doctor's office, we get white coat hypertension, while we're nervous. What's our blood pressure going to be? The other thing that it can drive is compensatory habits, where we've seen a large increase in drinking alcohol or overeating. It used to be the quarantine 15, and then there was the quarantine 20, and that's still creeping up. So whether it's social media, whether it's eating, whether it's drinking, we're also forming these short-term compensatory mechanisms that are actually leading to long-term consequences, because now, we're overweight, or we're drinking too much, or whatever.
So I want to talk about the book right off the bat here. I am, I've read, so I run on the anxious side. Jeremy's the depressed one. I'm the anxious one. So, I've read so many books, but like flipping through the pages of your book, I was like, wow, there's like real actionable stuff that I can recognize in my daily life. So I kind of wanted to just start at the very beginning with you and talk about really, what is anxiety, and why do I need to think about habits and addiction when we're talking about anxiety?
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you're asking that, because that's not a question that I even knew to ask when I was going through residency training. I didn't learn about this in medical school. I didn't learn it in residency. So if you think of the basic definition of anxiety, it's, this feeling of nervousness where you're unease about something with an uncertain outcome or an imminent event, right? So we all get anxious, right? Because the world is uncertain. We're going to have plenty of things every day that have uncertain outcomes, and it's how we respond to those that matters. So as a psychiatrist, I've been trained, give people medications. As an example, the hit rate, so to speak, for anxiety for medications, for gold standard medications, is about 20%. So I have to treat about 5 patients with medication before, on average, one shows a significant benefit or a significant reduction in symptoms. So I was even getting anxious myself in terms of, how am I going to help my patients? Because 20% is not as good as I want it to be. And this is where, my lab had been studying habit change for a while, where we found we could get 5 times the quit rates of gold standard treatment for smoking. And we got a 40% reduction with an app-based mindfulness training. And so, like, giving somebody an app, we got a 40% reduction in craving-related eating. So we had started to work out some of these behavioral and neurobiological mechanisms on how to change habits. And then I dug into the literature around anxiety. And lo and behold, somebody had suggested back in the 80s that anxiety could be driven in the same way as other habits. So my eyes popped out of my head. And when I put them back in, I was thinking, wow, I know a lot about how to change habits, but I'd never thought about approaching anxiety this way. And the basic premise is, 3 elements to any habit: a trigger, a behavior, and a reward. And so, for example, with stress eating, if we're anxious, we stress eat. And then the reward is that we distract ourselves, or we get a little bit of a dopamine hit from the food or whatever. But then we're not fixing the root cause of the anxiety. And in fact, we might be causing other problems. With anxiety itself, it can be driven through not only the feeling of worry, but the mental behavior of worry. So worrying about the future is that mental behavior that makes us feel like, well, I'm doing something, even if I can't change the outcomes. And that feeling of doing something is rewarding enough to perpetuate it, yet it feeds back and makes us more anxious.
I'm so glad you brought that up. That is exactly where I've been for the last 2 months. And I'm fully aware of it. For lunch, my choices were not good. And I was fully aware that this is bad for me. It's going to make me fat. I'm not going to feel good after I eat this. And yet I ate it anyways, because for 5 minutes, I wanted to not feel the anxious undercurrent that drives everything that I'm doing.
Yeah.
So how do I replace that reward with something bigger that's more meaningful? Because I've heard you talk about that willpower is not enough. I want to do better. I want to make better choices. I will make better choices for a week or two, and then I will fall off the wagon because for whatever reason it doesn't work out. How do I get over that hurdle? How do I get past that step of awareness to action?
Yeah, you're talking about, so this whole yo-yo dieting phenomenon has been active for almost half a century. You know, when Weight Watchers started, where they're like, just make sure you cut down on calories. The formula hasn't changed, you know, more calories out than in. Yet it's a great business model because you can say, well, the formula is right. You just failed the formula. So you need to join our program and stay in it longer or whatever.
Right.
But the idea, there was this great Bob Newhart skit from the 1970s called Just Stop It. And people have to watch this. It's hilarious. 5 minutes where basically you can imagine how it goes. Woman walks into the therapist's office. She says, I have this fear. And he leans over his desk and he says, just stop it. Right. So you can imagine how I would love if willpower works, because then my patients could come into my office and I would say, just stop smoking, just stop overeating, just stop worrying. And then, you know, one visit and they're done.
Right.
So that's not how our brains work. You know, if you think of the most optimistic perspective is that willpower gets depleted when we are, you know, over time, you know, end of the day, or, you know, I should say, and if there is willpower at all, our prefrontal cortex, which is where it depends or where it lives, so to speak, goes offline when we get stressed or anxious. So we can't rely on it when we're anxious. You know, in my addiction clinic, there's this saying, hungry, angry, lonely, tired, halt. When you're any of these things, you're more vulnerable to relapse because that willpower goes away. So let's say at best, willpower is you know, it's the weakling as part of our brain. It's the youngest from an evolutionary perspective. It's the weakest. It goes offline when we get stressed or anxious. So we can't actually rely on it. What we need to do is tap into the older, stronger parts of our brain. And this is where reward value comes in. You know, our brain's going to do things if they're rewarding. If we pay attention, we can help our brain see very clearly how rewarding something is right now versus how rewarding it was, say, when we started doing it, like when we started eating cake at birthday parties when we were 5, or when we started smoking when we were a teenager, or whatever that was. That's the key. And my lab's actually studied to see, you know, how effective that process is, but it really comes back to reward value. That's how our brains learn best.
So there was a key word in there that you mentioned, paying attention. It's actually 2 words, but paying attention. And I have flipped through your book, so I'm asking you very, very specifically, how do we pay attention better?
You're asking the essential question, and we can reduce it to one word, which is awareness. If you want to simplify it even more. So we can try to force ourselves to pay attention, but there are also ways that we can bring awareness in naturally that draw us in. And this is where I think of, and I write a lot about this in the book, I think of curiosity as our superpower, because when we're curious about something, we will naturally pay attention.
That makes sense. After, you know, reading through your book and looking at habit loops, I'm seeing them all over in things that I do now. I recognize them as a little bit depressing, too much of my day. How do you get through that? Like, now that I'm aware of these things, how do I be okay with that? I mean, it actually makes me a little bit anxious to realize there's so many habit loops that I need to change.
Yeah. This is so common that in our Unwinding Anxiety app and our Eat Right Now app, actually, we have this module called Muddy Waters, meaning, you know, you can think of this analogy of if there's this stream or this river and there's all this dirt on the bottom, the water looks clear, but as soon as we walk through the water, we're going to kick up all that dirt. Well, would you rather have that dirt kicked up now and keep kicking it up so that we can keep it in the water and have it wash downstream so we can see the bottom so we don't trip or whatever? Or would you rather let it build up more and more and more and more? So here I say to people, that's normal. It's better to know now, because the longer you perpetuate a habit, the harder it is to break. So for example, one of my patients who wanted to quit smoking, we calculated he had reinforced his habit loop about 293,000 times. He'd been smoking 40 years. So, you know, it's better to know at 20 years or 10 years or 5 years, whatever the habit is, even though it seems painful now that we're seeing it, it's better to know now than not to know.
Mm-hmm.
I want to go back to the idea of curiosity. And when I read that, the analogy that I drew in my mind was similar to a tool that I learned about managing pain a few years ago, where so often we're taught to distract yourself from the pain, look away, find some other way so that you don't experience it. I've found that through this technique of really leaning into the pain, being really aware of it, that it gets smaller and smaller and becomes much easier to manage than trying to look away from it. Is that kind of what you mean by getting curious about the anxiety and the driving emotions?
Yeah, absolutely. We can force ourselves to pay attention, or we can use that curiosity to help draw us in so we know that we're learning from it. I love this phrase. You may know it. The only way out is through.
I love that.
Yes. And it's so true, because we can try to, our natural reaction is when something's uncomfortable is to try to run away from it or push it away. But again, that just adds a Band-Aid, and then we have to deal with the wound itself as it starts to get infected. The most important thing is to see, oh, there's a wound. I need to wash this out carefully. I need to clean this so that it does not get infected. And what curiosity helps us do is provide that kind of antiseptic that says, okay, it's much better to know and deal with it now. And also to lean in. I love this idea of, this 2 steps forward, 1 step backwards. I think we can actually reimagine that paradigm, because the 1 step backward implies that we're failing. Like, oh no, I've taken a step backward. What I would suggest is that we often learn more from our failures than we do from just making progress. So if we step back, we look at that as, oh, what can I learn from this? Instead of, oh no, there's no such thing as failure, because we are always learning if we're open to that. And that's where the curiosity comes in. Oh, this is really uncomfortable. Okay, here, my wife calls this, she introduced me to the term, the FGO, the frickin' growth opportunity, right? So can we lean into this as an FGO as compared to running away from it?
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned your wife. I was watching your TED Talk that's very popular online. And my wife had a container of ice cream sitting out to sort of thaw. And you were on in the background. She was doing her thing, and she sort of heard it. And at the end, she went, "Okay, fine, go put the ice cream away. I don't need it after all." So that awareness is very powerful. Just
It
like
is.
taking that minute and going, "Why am I doing this? Do I need this, or is this just some reward or distraction for some bad behavior or whatever?" It's so funny how powerful that was.
Yes, awareness is king. And especially if we bring in that attitude of curiosity, I think of it as a superpower. It can really help us change a whole lot of things.
Yeah.
So you mentioned in the book too that, it's not just anxiety that can happen from these habit loops, that depression is also wildly popular with habit loops. Can you talk a little more about that?
Yes, our brains love to project, let's say. And so you can think of this as based on a survival mechanism where our thinking and planning part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, it takes previous scenarios and then it projects into the future so it can kind of help us say, okay, this is what's going to happen based on past behavior. So that tends to come in 2 flavors in our brain. So one thing that we do is we kind of do this, it's called perseveration, where we ruminate about the past and we say, oh no, and that's where it turns into this flavor. If you would use the ice cream theme, we're stirring in the chocolate. So that base of ice cream becomes chocolate ice cream. That base of thinking becomes depression. If we take that and we start worrying about the future and we start spinning in that direction, that's where we form the flavor of anxiety. So our brains, and there's a number of studies on this, our brains really do not spend a lot of time in the present moment. We're often regretting things we've done in the past or worrying about things that we are going to do in the future. Or if we're really good, we have that mixed cone of depression plus anxiety. And that I see that a lot as well.
It's delicious. I got to tell you. Yummy.
Yeah, unfortunately, that is my favorite flavor.
I wanted to ask you, sort of from an evolutionary perspective, we are very much at the whim of powerful interests that want to distract us all of the time, constantly. That feeds very well into how we've evolved as people. So, are we doomed And if not, how do we avoid our own destruction through just chasing the latest, greatest flashy device that beams out of our phone?
Yes. So I can't predict as to whether we are doomed or not. But what I can say is that the way to make sure that we are not doomed is to really learn how our minds work. So we know there's this very strong attention economy. It's very, it's a big profit machine. And, it's a corporation's job to make money, right? And so I'm not going to debate the merits of whether a corporation's good or not. There are many people that do that, much better than I do. But what I do know is the one thing that we do have control over is ourself. And so if we can learn how our minds work, we can then start to see how all of these processes are in play. And then we can be able to bring awareness in and choose whether to do X, Y, or Z rather than just habitually doing it, right? And so if the ice cream, we see the ice cream commercial, it looks great, we buy the ice cream, we put it out on the counter, we can still decide, well, am I hungry? Do I really want to eat this? Or if we go on social media and we find ourselves endlessly scrolling, we can ask ourselves, what am I getting from this? And then as we learn to see, oh, I'm in this habit loop, I'm bored, or I'm lacking, I feel like I need connection, we can then say, well, let me see if I can meet that need rather than just being, a rat pressing a lever for more, more dopamine hits on social media.
Right.
I had a question for you, but that last little bit of your comment really threw me off because it hit home a little too close. I did want to ask about procrastination a little bit. In, I guess I've made the excuse many times that I'm not anxious. I just like the pressure of working last minute on something. But in reading through your book and all of my research, there really is a strong link to these habit loops and anxiety and procrastination. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I can. And there are several pieces I think it's helpful to touch on. One is that procrastination tends to come in two flavors as well. So one is anxiety can drive us to procrastinate just because we're trying to avoid that thing that makes us anxious. There's also another flavor of perfectionism where we think, oh, this has to be perfect. And we're worried, oh no, I'm not going to do this perfectly. And that unpleasant feeling drives us to procrastinate. And there may be other sub flavors as well. I'm sure there are 31 flavors of procrastination, but those are the two favorites that I see. So there, just mapping out these procrastination habit loops can really help us see, is this procrastination helping? The other piece there that you're touching on is around performance anxiety, right? I need to be anxious to get this project done. Mm-hmm. Well, this is a fallacy that's actually been, I don't know if a word, memeified or, really put out there on the internet as being this true thing. And I actually went and chased down the meme. It goes back to a study from 1908. Are you ready for this? Japanese dancing mice. And I give some details about this in the book if people are really interested in geeking out about it. But basically, these researchers found that if they shocked Japanese dancing mice, if they shocked them a moderate amount, they would do better in whatever, maze or whatever they were trying to use as a surrogate for some human behavior. And then if they shocked them too much, shock of all shocks, they didn't do so well, right? Mm-hmm. There was a guy who Hans Selye, I believe, who gave a talk in the 50s. So people largely ignored this study, cited like 4 times, between then and the 50s. And then this guy Selye comes along and he gives this talk where he suggests, without any evidence, that possibly anxiety could be driving enhanced performance. And then one of Selye's old graduate students went on and claimed, he said, so these two guys, Japanese dancing mice, it was Yerkes Dodson. So he said, therefore, he held rats' heads underwater and then found that if you held them underwater too long, shocked, they didn't perform as well. Well, how do you account for them just trying to catch their breath is one of my questions. But he claimed that this Yerkes Dodson model was law. They called it the Yerkes Dodson law, that moderate amounts of anxiety helped people perform. With, again, no evidence for this. These are all rat and mouse experiments. And they were linking anxiety with just arousal, just interchange them. When you look at the actual literature, and there's a great review article, I think from 1915 or 2015, where they highlighted how this Yerkes-Dodson thing went from being cited fewer than 10 times to 100 times, fewer than 10 times in the 90s, 100 times by like year 2000, and over 1,000 times by 2010. So this exponential curve, probably due to the internet and people saying, oh, performance anxiety, let's see if it's just true. 10 times as many studies show that there is a direct inverse relationship between anxiety and performance, as in any amount of anxiety decreases performance as compared to the ones that suggest that it enhances performance. And in fact, if you look at it, anxiety makes your thinking and planning brain go offline. So why would it improve performance? So here, I would say anybody can do their own experiment and explore, is anxiety actually helping me? The best way to do that is to clone yourself and then be calm and curious and passionate and say, which one helps me get the job done better? I would say keeping your prefrontal cortex online is probably the way to go, but we can all do that experiment for ourselves.
It's interesting because hearing you say that, it seems so logical, because you hear so often about like getting into that flow state, doing the thing that you love, where time just sort of vanishes and you're just into it. There is no anxiety in that state. You are just riding the wave of productivity, whatever it is.
Absolutely. And people talk about flow as optimal performance, like it doesn't get any better than that.
Right. Absolutely. I want to, in our sort of our closing minutes here, let's talk about some strategies. What can people do to really practice this awareness? And you mentioned that meditation is not even necessarily required to get the benefits of meditation. What can people do when they feel the panic attack coming on? They've recognized the habit loop, whatever their method is. What are some tools that people can employ to start fighting back?
Yeah. So I would say, 1, 2, and 3, awareness, awareness, awareness. And so of course I can't just write awareness and have that be an entire book.
Yeah.
So yeah, one page with a bunch of blank pages and a few references. So the key, I split the book out into a 3-step process based on what I've been seeing in my research and in my clinic. And then I can detail all the research about how this actually works as part of it. Step 1, map out these habit loops. We even provide this free habit mapper on mapmyhabit.com, where anybody can download this thing and just print it out and start mapping out their habit loops. What's the trigger? What's the behavior? What's the result? Whether it's worrying, whether it's procrastination, whether it's overeating, whatever it is, anybody can do that. The second step is really hacking our brain's reward processing system, where we can ask a simple question like, what am I getting from this? Am I worrying? Is the worrying fixing the problem? Is it keeping my family safe? No. But it's not just an intellectual understanding. It's about feeling into that and also seeing that the worrying is actually perpetuating and driving more anxiety, so that we start to become disenchanted, where we can see very clearly the worrying didn't fix the problem. It didn't make me feel safer, and it actually made me more anxious. We start to become disenchanted with that. Same for overeating, same for smoking, same for procrastinating. Third step is bringing in this bigger, better offer. I call these the BBOs. And I give a bunch of tools that people can actually use pragmatically. Again, they come in these 2 main flavors of curiosity and kindness. So basically, when you think of anxiety, it closes us down. It makes us feel wound up. Curiosity and kindness both open us, and you can't be closed and open at the same time. They're binary opposites. So anything that can help open us up, whether it's practicing gratitude, practicing kindness, remembering when somebody was kind to us, or just being curious, oh, what's this anxiety feel like in this moment? That, starts to open us up already.
And you mentioned a couple of different apps I'm curious about. Tell me about the apps that you use to help people with their various issues.
So we have a smoking app called Craving to Quit, one for emotional and overeating called Eat Right Now, and then one to help people with anxiety called Unwinding Anxiety. And this is the one where we got a 67% reduction in these clinically validated anxiety scores. So, some evidence-based tools that people can use, if they prefer not to read a book or something like that.
Well, I downloaded the Unwinding Anxiety app because I definitely need that. Sounds like I might need the eating one as well.
Well, the nice thing is it starts to generalize. So we find that somebody uses one of the apps and they learn how their mind works. And then they're like, oh, I'm actually applying this to changing my eating habits if they're working on anxiety. And so the nice thing is, what we try to do is just help people understand how their minds work and then let them go from there.
It's all great stuff. Is there anything important that you want to add that we didn't get to here?
I think we covered it all.
All right. Fantastic. Thank you so much. A lot of fun talking with you, and great work again on the book and all you do. Thanks so much for all you do.
No, thank you. It was a pleasure.
Awesome. Thank you.